Hello, and welcome to the Quantum Fit Podcast. I'm Taylor, and I am your host. This podcast is all about applying the different principles of quantum physics and quantum biology to your health and fitness. This gives us a holistic view of how certain environmental factors, like sunlight or cold, play a huge role in your overall health, not just diet, exercise, or developing good habits. If you want to really make lasting changes in how you feel, think, and act, then I'd recommend you try to listen closely and have an open mind to what I have to say. Every day I put out a 7 to 15 minute long podcast episode. It's short like this because it's informative, but also to the point, so you don't feel so overwhelmed with information. I also don't do any kind of advertisements on the episodes right now, so instead, I ask that you share this podcast with a friend or family member if you enjoyed the message and gained something from it. I want to be able to spread quality and easy to understand content that everyone can take and use in their daily lives. I would highly appreciate it. Alright, on to today's episode, Force Fields in Nature. Oh, and sorry if yesterday, the two podcast episodes were a little heavy. I mean, even for me, usually I'm okay even reading through just studies, scientific studies, and usually I do all right with, some of the complicated words, terms, and stuff they use, but that was a pretty heavy section. So today, I'm going to make it a little bit more straightforward, a little bit easier to understand, and try to keep it a little bit shorter. So here we go. I'm going to be covering a fairly straightforward topic today by answering the question, how do cells protect themselves? Just to be clear here, I'm not talking about the immune system per se. I'm speaking about each individual cell. How does it protect itself? Or at least, what's the main mechanism for protecting itself? If there's anything that a cell encounters, whether it's a virus, bacteria, some other pathogen, or say a toxin, allergen, whatever it is, each individual cell has an extremely powerful ability that allows it to block anything bad from entering, under certain conditions. If you listen to my first podcast, you can guess what those conditions are. Now, I've mentioned it before, I believe in my previous podcast episode, but the first part of our equation is structured water. This is a specific type of water that both naturally forms next to most materials and is created in abundance by mitochondria in the process of creating energy. This special structured water fills the entirety of basically every single cell, and including the phospholipid bilayer, that very outer small outer shell of cells. And this outer shell is the area where our force field appears. It should be noted that this water is extremely conductive. In some living tissues, it can even be superconductive. This means that the voltage is never lost across that tissue. The second part that makes up our force field is voltage. This is also generated by the mitochondria, and I've gone over this topic quite a bit in my 4th and 5th episodes. When a strong enough voltage is coursing through the entire outer layer of a cell, it creates a Faraday cage, which is essentially a force field for the cell. A Faraday cage is any kind of enclosure that is both grounded and highly conductive. The most common example is a literal metal mesh cage. When it's set up properly, it will block almost all electromagnetism from getting inside the cage, minus extremely low frequency like the fields put out by Earth. Those can actually sneak through due to their very, very long wavelengths. A car is also a good example of a Faraday cage. If lightning strikes an older vehicle made mostly of metal, the electricity will actually conduct across the car's metal frame and safely discharge directly into the ground. Note that this is kind of just a for fun fact, but it's falsely believed that when lightning hits a car, it'll end up, going through the tires into the ground, but that's impossible because tires are made of rubber, and rubber is highly, highly resistant. It's an insulator, so it can't conduct electricity. No, lightning actually just skips the jump. It skips, through air and strikes the ground. Anyway, continuing on. Let's get back to the cell's outer layer. If we have highly conductive structured water and the cell gets a large voltage spread across it around the entire cell, we now have a grounded and highly conductive shield that acts as a force field. The cell can now repel anything it damn well pleases by rejecting the charges of pathogens and toxins. Without this shield, those bad things, whatever they are, again, would easily trick the cell and be able to affect it through lining up specific charges and attaching to the cell. Does that make sense? So I'll kind of put it in a different way. The different pathogens and toxins, the way they normally are able to communicate with the cell and again, trick it or get into the cell, is they're using specific voltages, right? It always comes down to the different charges lining up. But if you have this Faraday cage going on, the Faraday cage can, the cell is able to just block any of it from happening. It can block whatever it wants from getting in, so it'll stop anything from touching it. The cell literally becomes bulletproof to pathogens. Pathogens there's no way for them to get through it. Again, this is all assuming you have a strong enough voltage. But, as I alluded to towards the beginning of this podcast, you can only get this really, really strong voltage through your cells when your light environment is right, your EMF exposure is low, and you're eating a ton of seafood. And I'll get to the point of why seafood is so essential in a later episode. But that's all I've got for you guys. I hope you enjoyed today's message, and hopefully this is something new that you learned. If you have any questions or comments, you can send them to me on Instagram at RealQuantumFit. You can find me on my personal Facebook page, Taylor Kelson. Or you can send a voice message across Anchor if you're listening to me on the app. All right, I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.